Peter Bergen. I run the International Security Program. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Sunil Khilnani, who is a longtime friend of New America and who actually had the bad judgment to hire me at one point at SAIS. When Sunil ran the South Asia department at SAIS for many years, he then moved to King's, where he's a professor. He wrote The Idea of India, which I think is really the best single book to try and explain India in the post-World War II era. And he's just published Incarnations, A History of India in 50 Lives, which has been the subject of the most stellar reviews imaginable in the UK and was published this week in the United States. So Sunil is going to give us an overview of some of the big themes and stories in the book, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. It's a real pleasure to be back here, and I'm really grateful to you at this time when there are many other political events preying on people's minds, and thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm going to talk about my new book and really try and set out some of the larger arguments in the book, as well as talk through some of the particular stories that are in the book, because it is a book ultimately of 50 stories, which I hope once you read through them, and you certainly don't have to read through them in sequence, but once you do read through them, will give you a sense of the long arc of Indian history, something that I think has often been missing in the age of professional specialization, where everyone knows their decade or their moment or their region or their period. And I've tried to stand back and offer a larger story about the shape of Indian history and what I think are some of the important lines of conflict and contradiction in it. History in any country is a form of capital. It's a resource that governments, political movements, academics all want to monopolize. And that's, I think, especially true in India, a relatively new nation created out of the only civilization where all four great religions, all four great world religions, have at different times ruled and collided. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. The competition amongst believers to control history struck me constantly as I traveled across India working on my book. And perhaps nowhere more vividly so than in an obscure, sleepy village in central India. In that village, Sanati, there's a tiny temple dedicated to a Hindu goddess, Kalikamba. And some years ago, a huge storm smashed the roof over her head. When workers cleared the rubble, they flipped over the altar stone. Its center had been smashed out in order to hold the square pedestal on which the goddess stood. And on the underside were inscriptions in the ancient Brahmi script. 2 rock edicts of the 3rd century emperor Ashoka, the famous follower of the Buddha, who ruled over much of India. Brahmin priests had literally overturned that earlier history, repurposing Ashoka's stone as a base for their own deity. And Ashoka's message on this particular edict? An eloquent call for respecting those whose beliefs are different from your own. So even if Ashoka might not have, I think at least we can appreciate the irony. It's long frustrated me how the richness of Indian history gets flattened by and subordinated to collective belief, whether religious or ideological, as happened first with colonialism and later with nationalism. Myth and legend replaced context and history. Complex individuals are reborn as cartoon figures and turned into these mythic, heroic types. And it becomes harder and harder to really grasp how contemporary India, one of the world's most, I think, inventive democratic experiments and an emerging economic dynamo, how contemporary India came to be. So over the years, I've been thinking about how a fresh approach to explaining Indian history could be worked out, one that would allow me to tell the stories, the fascinating stories of the men and women who made that history. I wanted to tell those stories in a form that was both nuanced and rigorous in terms of its scholarship, but also humanly compelling, and perhaps even actually inspiring. For Indian collisions between multiple beliefs and traditions, have brought forth, I think, some of history's most interesting social, philosophical, and practical innovators. Gandhi with his creative nonviolence, to name an obvious one. And it seemed to me that the ideas of other Indian thinkers, people like Periyar or Ambedkar, or even painters like Amrita Shergill, to name three who figure in my book, that these are too important to be buried in scholasticism, because they have a lot to contribute to some of the urgent, entrenched problems of India today, and indeed, I think, of the world at large. And that's what led me to embark on this very long journey through Indian cities and villages that became Incarnations. It's a book that, starting with the Buddha, traces some 2,500 years of Indian history through 50 people: scientists, philosophers, kings, artists, photographers, freedom fighters, industrialists, musicians, mathematicians, a second-century healer whose lessons on Ayurveda are still used to treat conditions from infertility to diabetes around the world today. The baby-faced monk Vivekananda, who effectively founded yoga while living in Manhattan in the 1890s, as it happens. Now, some of the names in the book are well known, but I think misunderstood, so including Vivekananda, who was a perceptive critic of many aspects of Hinduism, but has been turned into a kind of mascot of the Hindu right. Some, like Pillai, Chidambaram Pillai, the plucky South Indian freedom fighter who decided to take on the British Empire's shipping might, are hardly known at all today. And nearly all of the stories that I tell shall shine a light on conflicts, I think, that are still wrenching India today. Now, to tell these stories accurately, I explored important new scholarship, so archaeological discoveries, advances in the understanding of Sanskrit science and art history, newly recovered documents. That's from Ramanujan's so-called lost notebook, which I consulted at the Trinity Library in Cambridge, declassified files, secret material that's been released. I drew upon all these sources, not just to bring his precision to historical biography, but in order to puncture, above all, some of the stereotypes held about India. Stereotypes that reign not just in the minds of Westerners, but in the minds of Indians too. In short, I think India's simply too important to the world to be so simplistically understood. And so I decided to demythologize Indian history a little in order to rehumanize it again. So let me start with the first real individual I think we can find in Indian history, and that's Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha. We think of him primarily as a beatific spiritual master, right? I mean, we think of him as an icon whose teachings now are followed by more than 1 billion people, and who's concerned with transcending the material world. But in the North India, where he was born around the 5th century BC, he was also a political radical. He was envisaging an alternative society so threatening to the established order that even as his teachings spread across the world, they were virtually obliterated for centuries in his own country of birth. Born to privilege, the Buddha undertook the great renunciation that's common to many Indian stories. But in achieving it, he laid out not just spiritual practices, but also revolutionary social ones. He and his followers rejected the rigid caste order upheld by Brahmins. They enacted a series of unorthodox ideas about the inclusion of women in worship, about the idea of shared property and collective decision-making, about the expansion of literacy to lower caste people, something that the Brahminic order forbade. And he was, in other words, a threat to the reigning power structures. So as Buddhism flourished in Tibet, in Japan, in Indonesia, and China, it was stamped out in India. Which makes it even more striking that Buddhism, after a long historical suppression, the Buddha erupts back into 20th century Indian history through the imaginative struggles of another misunderstood thinker who I write about, B.R. Ambedkar. He's the one in the blue suit there, which he made fashionable across India. Ambedkar was born an untouchable. He was one of the architects of the Indian Constitution, but he turned ultimately to the Buddha as an example of worldly liberation from oppression. His quite surprising political incarnation of the Buddha has made this ancient teacher today an icon in the struggles against the caste system. Take it from Vijay, a young friend I made in the slums in the course of my work on this book. His family, Vijay's family, comes from a historically despised Dalit caste, untouchables in the language of old. That's him there, and that's the Buddha, that's Ambedkar, and those are two other figures I write about in the book, Shivaji and Phule. Now, what Vijay told me, as he explained to me, is that, and these are his words, the Buddha has no caste, so I have no caste. Buddha represents caste equality to Vijay. And so this is how the Buddha has returned himself in contemporary Indian life, not as a remote spiritual figure offering enlightenment, but as a crucial, guiding, everyday historical presence with a liberating message for tens of thousands, tens of millions of stigmatized Indians and for the nation as a whole. And that's one of the sense in which I intend my title, Incarnations, that these are lives from the distant past that have been brought to life for new purposes again and again in today's India. These are lives that have been infused with different meanings, and often their original meanings. Here's another stereotype of India, that it's a land of mystical traditions, remote from steely analytical thought. Now, in Mysore, in South India, I got to hold in my hands a text from before the Common Era that contradicts that view. Inscribed on palm leaves, the manuscript was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century, and it proved that Indian thinking had, in the person of a man called Kautilya, a political mind that made Machiavelli, who lived some 1,500 years after Kautilya, look gentle as a lamb. 2 millennia ago, Kautilya was counseling kings in the treacherous arts of what today we would call disinformation, surveillance, and covert ops. Here's but one sentence from this work, this unnervingly ruthless strategic work. And Kautilya writes, "An arrow unleashed by an archer may kill a single man or not kill anyone, but a strategy unleashed by a wise man kills even those still in the womb." There's nothing mystical about Kautilya. Rather, he advocates guile, cunning, and deceit as essential to maintaining power. And today, his cutthroat advice has become a guide to corporate success in a competitive economy. His Baudelaires work is a manual for aspiring entrepreneurs. And I'm told that the Pakistani army even prescribes Kautilya to their trainee officers as a way to gain insight into the devious Indian mind. But not many outside of India have heard of Kautilya, and even few in the country actually study him. And so a very significant strain of Indian political philosophy, and not to mention a really good read, is exiled from its rightful position as, I think, a classic of international thought. Focusing, as tends to happen today, on the Indian growth story, we risk losing the backstory, the story that goes some way to explaining India's current economic surge. Take scientific rigor in Indian thought. As my book shows, it wasn't born yesterday. But the legendary Panini, perhaps the greatest ever logician of how language works, is hardly known beyond a few Sanskrit scholars. If you Google his name, you'll get advice on Italian sandwiches. Now, Panini lived sometime in the 4th century, in the very northwest of the subcontinent. Interestingly, what today would be Afghanistan. So it's not even that he actually lived in one of the central bits of India, present-day India. And all we have of him is a single Sanskrit text, the Ashtadhyayi. It means 8 chapters. And it was written down much, much later after he lived. Briefly, and I won't go into the details, Panini produced what's known as a generative grammar, identifying and formalizing the rules that described not just all the existing features of Sanskrit usage, but were capable of generating a virtually infinite number of grammatically correct statements. So not just current Sanskrit utterances, but any possible future sentences could be derived from this system. And he did this through rules which he put in extraordinarily concise form, in sutras or verses in the form of code. And to give you an idea of the compression he achieved, an English translation of Panini's work runs to about 1,300 pages. His own Sanskrit text is just 40 pages. And it remains one of the most remarkable analysis of language I think ever produced. And even contemporary linguistic theorists like Chomsky regard him with awe. And some have seen a relationship between Panini's analysis of language and modern IT programming. And there is a way in which he invented a kind of algorithmic system. And I won't push the thought too far, but I don't think it's far-fetched to see some link between the ability to grasp Sanskrit's architecture and skill in the languages of modern computer programming. Another theme running through my book is, I think, relevant to attempts today to stifle free expression in India. Libraries have been burned over history that's deemed offensive. Books have been pulped. Scholars have been harassed. As many of the life stories I set out to make clear, what's driven India, what's made it stronger and less oppressive historically, has been the spirit of dissent. Rabble-rousers and critics who bravely took on their society and its customs, I think, contributed far more than we sometimes like to acknowledge to India's contemporary incarnation as a global power. And they've also often managed to drive significant social change. Take, for instance, the systematic oppressions and outright crimes against Indian women. They're a legitimate cause for despair, but it's also important to note that conditions aren't uniformly dismal across the country. In the more progressive South, for instance, child marriage, the marriage of young women, and fertility rates are far lower than in North India. And in the South, female literacy and employment rates are higher. Now, to point this divergence out isn't to suggest some deep cultural difference between North and South, but I think it's to recognize that inroads have been made by reform movements, especially in the story I tell, by one led by a school dropout from the South, the Tamil leader known as Periyar. With his wild beard and his general demeanor, he looks to me like a beat poet, down to the little dog he kept beside him to scare off Brahmins. Periyar was also an atheist and a rationalist, beliefs that can get you killed in India today. And from the 1920s to the 1970s, he waged an intellectual campaign against upper caste northerners who he felt were dominating Indian politics and the national movement. He set himself up as the anti-Gandhi, so where to counter Gandhi's habit of dressing in white, Periyar always wore black. And one of the things he pressed for was equality and greater freedom for women. For almost half a century, he advocated women's rights and unhindered access to contraception, for instance, in blunt fighting prose. Here's an example taken from one of his many newspapers that he published. And these are his words. "Have cats ever freed rats? Have foxes ever liberated goats or chickens? Have whites ever enriched Indians? Have Brahmins ever given non-Brahmins justice? We can be confident that women will never be emancipated by men." Women, he would say again and again, had to free themselves through their own personal and political action. And as I traced the rise of this whip-tongued reformer and the careers of other social disruptors that I write about, I was struck repeatedly by a simple historical truth of how under sustained and creative criticism, even the most rigid societies can change. Of course, the most eccentric and celebrated Indian reformer of modern times was Gandhi, often portrayed as a spiritual paragon, someone who transcends his historical moment. But in the story I tell of his surprising rise to power, I hope to get you to see him with a bit more nuance, as an individual whose flaws and eccentricities were matched by some very modern strategic gifts. For one, he was a brilliant maker and exploiter of the mass media and of its images, a guy who could have taught some current corporate titans a thing or two about branding. Gandhi's most famous act of nonviolent resistance was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. It was a 200-mile protest march from his ashram to the sea in Western India. And its nominal goal was to pick up a handful of salt from the seashore, defying what many considered an unfair British tax on an essential household good. Gandhi's idea to make salt the symbol of British oppression, he always said later, came to him in a flash of inspiration. It just It was his inner voice, some kind of divine thought that occurred to him. But in fact, he planned and managed the march's execution for weeks in advance, and with uncanny grasp of the media as a political tool. So the 79 marchers who accompanied him, well, each was chosen and vetted by Gandhi himself. What they were, no political colleagues were invited, lest they distract attention from Gandhi at the center of the march. The marchers' outfits, well, Gandhi designed them. No political insignia were allowed in order that the procession could convey a timeless, universal quality. He alone was allowed to carry a stick. And he made sure that he sent an advance crew of his followers to every village where he was about to arrive in order to whip up excitement. And as he marched through the villages, he was also followed by motor brigades of camera crews from around the world. And those two he had very carefully invited and vetted. He allowed about 3 or 4 camera crews and photographers and film people to follow him. And so, and in fact, it's also interesting that when he knew that they were filming, he explicitly speeded up the pace at which he was walking, so it looked like he was walking at this very fast pace. And so the jiggly footage of the Mahatma striding across the dusty plains, leading his band of followers, was imprinted on the imaginations of people all across the world. The tiny stick man with teapot ears showing up the imperial blimps. Some months later, Time magazine would draw him for their cover, a cover in which he's shown studying a newspaper, perhaps reading of his own success at managing the media around the world. Now, to see Gandhi as a strategist in that sense is not, of course, to diminish him. It's to bring to life a leader who ranks among a small handful of contemporaries who've remade the modern world. But unlike a Stalin or a Hitler or a Mao, Gandhi won power through nonviolence, and his goals were infinitely different and required, as I tell in my book, real grit and nerve to achieve. Now, perhaps of all the stereotypes that Indians trade in when considering historical figures, some of the most damaging relate to women. Given the deep roots of Indian patriarchy, it's actually much harder to find historical records for significant females than it is for their male counterparts. And that absence of sources plays into a sort of absurd cultural tendency to turn real women of intellection, fallibility, and bravery into goddess-type figures, figures that might be worshipped by women today, but not emulated. Consider the case of Lakshmi Bai, the Rani or Queen of Jhansi, who resisted British rule during the uprising of 1857. This Jezebel Rani, as the British termed her, would be commemorated in Western, Victorian, and later adventure and romance novels as a tempestuous villainess. And meanwhile, most Indians know her as a heroine frozen in a single dramatic image, astride a leaping horse, sword raised high, her adopted son clinging to her back. The British are about to conquer her fort, and instead of surrendering, she makes a bold midnight escape over the ramparts. That's a statue just below the fort where she is supposed to have leapt from. And that's the place. And as I looked down from this spot, down from the fort walls that she supposedly leapt over, only one word came to my mind, which was splat. And yet she's been stuck in this militant flying goddess version of history that, like the Western Jezebel versions, leaves little room for an actual earthbound real person, a woman struggling to rule over a kingdom that the British were trying to grab for themselves. So it's a relief to gain a more intimate sense of her from contemporary sources that only have recently been translated in full. She was, it emerges, strong of mind and body, so weightlifting, wrestling, and steeplechase were just her pre-breakfast routine. She was indifferent to regal trappings, in contrast to her cross-dressing husband, and she was so hands-on as a ruler that she often punished criminals herself with the whack of a stick. And as I tell in my book, under pressure from the British, the anxious queen decided that rebels marching from the north might help her hold on to her kingdom, a decision with tragic results on both sides. So as I narrate the story of a woman ruler who took on the British and was killed by them, a further goal of mine is to restore to the Indian past something it's decidedly short on, and that is sophisticated, judgment-making female leaders, real individuals grappling with difficult conditions that today's young people in India might actually engage with. Another pernicious stereotype that traps the Indian imagination concerns race, a subject I explore in my essay on an astoundingly resourceful Ethiopian teenager shipped to India as a slave and who rose to become a power broker in the Deccan Plains. Malik Ambar. You probably haven't heard the name because he's one of the remarkable historical figures who get excluded from the pantheon because they don't fall into any of the standard narrative silos of Indian history, Hindu, Muslim, or European. Traveling across India working on my book, I heard many young Indians extol the bravery of Shivaji, the 17th century Hindu Maratha warrior who defied the Mughals, and he serves today as a symbol of Hindu pride and resistance to Muslim rule. But when I mentioned Malik Ambar, who beat back the Mughal expansion before Shivaji, eyes went blank. And that, I think, is a real shame, because Malik Ambar's story is one of genuine, improbable self-making. Malik Ambar was human chattel, shipped from Africa in exchange for Indian cloth, part of a thriving but now little remembered slave trade that sailed eastwards to India as against the more well-known pattern westwards from Africa to North America. An indentured warrior when he arrived in the Deccan, he was forced to fight for Deccan potentates who owned him. But on the side, he quietly racked up non-martial skills, multiple languages, irrigation engineering, and accounting amongst them. And before long, his master recognized that he was not just a great fighter, but a brilliant strategic mind. Freed by that master on his own deathbed, Malik Ambar quickly amassed power of his own. Through guerrilla tactics in the very treacherous Deccan landscape, the Ethiopian and his army of crack horsemen stopped the southward thrust of the Mughal Emperor Akbar and his son Jahangir. And ultimately, Malik Ambar gained control over much of the Deccan. Indeed, he was such a nemesis of the Mughals that the Emperor Jahangir took to commissioning gruesome miniature paintings like this one, in which he beheaded the Ethiopian on paper, a fantasy that the emperor failed time and again to achieve in real life. But Jahangir might have been pleased had he foreseen the future, because that has secured the elimination pretty much of Malik Ambar from Indian history. Malik Ambar wasn't a Hindu native defending some ancient motherland. He was an African outsider and thereby destined to be diminished in a society that still today is deeply prejudiced against dark skin color. In fact, today, descendants of African slaves like him live poor and ghettoized, many in the western state of Gujarat. And it's maddening that children growing up in these shunned communities find no mention in their school books, for instance, of a self-made power entrepreneur whose skin color and lineage they share. Now, occasionally in slums or village lanes, as I researched Incarnations, I overheard teenagers explaining to their friends what I was up to. And it went along the lines of, he's telling the story of how India became number one. Indeed, it's a habit of national histories to justify the present as the perfect and necessary outcome of what came before. But as I worked on this book, I was struck again and again by how many of these 50 individuals from the Indian past posed, like Malik Ambar, really sharp challenges to the Indian present. Through religious collisions and philosophical encounters, moral experiments, those individuals were part of arguments that have been kept going for millennia in India about what kind of life is worth leading, about what kind of society is worth having, which hierarchies are morally legitimate, what role religion has in the legal and political order, what kind of love is valid, who owns the water and the land, and what kind of place India should be. A civilization that can produce a Buddha and a Mirabai, a Phule, a Gandhi, a Dhirubhai Ambani. That civilization, I think, is open both to radical experiments with self-definition and to productive arguments about what a country and its people should value. And such energy, such diverse energy, is, I think, worth celebrating, especially at a time when religious nationalists in India want to transform this multiplicity of ideas, of creative self-criticism and dissidence, into a singular ideological brew. So I'm arguing for a version of history that creates options for the future instead of foreclosing them. A rich history that expands the world's store of available ideas and ideals. After all, it's not just Indians who have a stake in a country where 1/5 of humanity resides. Keeping India's future open enlarges the world. Thank you.
Sunil, thank you for that brilliant presentation. The Wall Street Journal reviewed your book, and I think they did something which I think is not a particularly fair way of reviewing, but it does raise an interesting question. I mean, because they reviewed the book on the basis of what you didn't include.
Right.
Which I think is sort of the most unfair way to review somebody, because obviously you made decisions about why these people were important. So what was the decision-making process you had about inclusion? Obviously you had to make some choices about these 50. How did the 50 number come about? And the origin of this was in a BBC radio show, so if you could explain the process.
Sure. No, thanks, Peter. No, in fact, I mean, in many ways, the Wall Street Review does exactly what I would like people to do in some way, which is that, I say in the very first few pages of the book, in the introduction, that this book is an invitation to an argument. These are my selections of figures from the Indian past. It's obviously not an encyclopedia. It's obviously not a kind of definitive Noah's Ark of the figures you need. You sail off with them, and then the rest can kind of go to the devil.
Yeah.
So it's really an attempt to get people to think about who are the figures that are important and why. And I'll explain why I selected these in a moment. But I mean, it was an attempt at a moment in India where you either have a kind of nationalist pantheon or you have counter pantheon, to say, look, there's a much richer variety that one can draw on. They don't necessarily, you can tell the longer story of Indian history, but without having to fit it into a singular narrative, either a narrative of the nation or a narrative of a religious collectivity or whatever it might be. So I wanted 50 who would show the diversity of activity that Indians have engaged in, and that's why it ranges not just from political figures, but to scientists, artists, poets, filmmakers, the whole range of different fields. Because I don't think you can, or in industrialists, etc., I don't think you can capture India through one lens. And the reason that my selection, well, first there were several steps to it. I mean, first, I had a much longer list, but thank God, both for the BBC and for me, we didn't do 100, we did 50. that was enough of a killer. And once I got down to the 50, I didn't miss the other 50, the ones that I had left aside. And my intention was to have a reasonable mix of figures who are well known because they should be there, but also figures who would be surprising. Who would allow me to tell something about Indian history. And in choosing the figures I did, I wanted them to allow me to talk about some of the central conflicts or contradictions or tensions that have run through Indian history. So, for instance, caste or regional tensions. I write about Sheikh Abdullah. I have a lot about the South. Those sorts of issues. Or about gender. And although I don't have a large number of women in the book, because one of the problems, as I mentioned, was getting sources for individual women, the theme or the question of women's position in society and their rights runs right through many of the essays in the book, from the Buddha to Mahavir to Guru Nanak to Periyar to Tagore to it's there in many. So issues like that, caste, region, gender, but also individual freedom. Individual expression. So the Tagore essay is partly about the freedom to love who you want. And Amrita Sher Gill, the painter, I also write about that. So that was another strong criteria. And finally, and this goes back to the title, figures who on the whole had an afterlife, who are back in play in contemporary Indian political debate and argument. So Subhash Chandra Bose, for instance, who took a violent approach to fighting the British, who is now, a source of much debate in India, the one kind of military hero of the nationalist movement. So those were the sort of criteria that I brought to bear.
And this originated in a BBC radio series.
Yes, that's right. So the idea was, can one tell a complex history of India based on the best scholarship there is, but for a wider audience? That's really part of also the mission of the institute that I founded at King's College in London, at the India Institute, which is, can we produce really great scholarship, but in a way that both the policy world but also the wider world can engage with. So when the BBC came to me and said, they wanted to do something on Indian history, I thought that would be a great platform. And they'd never done a 50-part program series on Indian history.
How long were these segments?
They were each 15 minutes.
Right.
And they're all available also on podcasts on iTunes. They're free on iTunes and the BBC site. And I made many long trips, 6 long trips across India with producers to do this. But this was a major investment for the BBC. And I just thought it was a great opportunity to tell a different story about India. And to do it through lives gave me a kind of storyline for each episode, rather than, dynasties or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's a wonderful storytelling device. Otherwise, it's just one thing after another.
Yeah.
Indian history being so long. But another question is, I mean, the book was published in India. It's in a sense Modi's India right now. And you mentioned in your introduction, books have been banned, and there's a kind of tightening of the sphere right in India right now in terms of what you can say, or I mean, how much of that? I mean, and how was it received? And is it an implied critique of kind of the India as it exists today?
Well, one hopes that everything one writes is somehow critically engaged with the world as it is, regardless of who particularly happens to be in power. So I think even the earlier stuff I've written is, I hope, always has a critical dimension to it, and this certainly does. I think that we're going through a complicated moment in India today. That as in many parts of the world, there's a kind of upsurge of a particular kind of nationalism. There's a belief that any criticism of that or any dissent from that is somehow anti-national. And in much of my work, what I've tried to argue is that actually the conception of what is the nation in India has always been much, much broader than modern European nationalism allows. I mean, Indian nationalism is a very distinctive way of thinking about the nation. It wasn't like European nationalism. It wasn't defined in terms of a single religion or language or race or whatever. So this book is consistent with that argument, saying there are many different strands to what, and these strands are a source of strength for contemporary India. It's not something that we have to somehow assimilate or damp down. The very diversity, the very kind of regional, dissent and so on, is a source of India's strength because it keeps it open. And so, I actually, I mean, the book, I'm very happy, has had a very generous reaction in India. Maybe my potential opponents don't read or haven't read it sufficiently carefully. But it is going to be translated into some of the Indian languages as well, which I'm very pleased about. There's going to be a kind of a version of it done for a younger readership as well, which I'm very pleased about, because this is a book that's trying to make history come alive at a time when either it's being commandeered by power for ideological reasons, or it's just being hopelessly badly taught at school. So you can then play fast and loose with the facts because no one challenges it. And I want to say, to a younger audience, look, there is this great past. And there are also facts on which you can make claims and counterclaims. You can't just, it's not just stories, it's empirically grounded stories.
Anybody have a question? Raise your hand and identify yourself. And wait for the mic. Chris, do you have the mic? Yeah, this gentleman here.
Hi, thanks. It was a brilliant talk. Thanks very much. I was struck at one point you mentioned that the Pakistanis were reading a book by one of the people that you mentioned in the among the 50.
Kautilya, the Arthashastra, yeah.
Isn't Indian history and Pakistani history the same? So it seems to me that these figures are relevant to Pakistan as much as they are to India today. So that's just...
Thank you. No, that's a very, very useful and great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And the way I dealt, I said early on that this is a nation built on a much older civilization. And in the book, there's a map of the subcontinent with, roughly where we know where we think some of the people were born. And in some cases, we're not sure. But it takes India as the whole subcontinent. There are no national boundaries drawn on that map. And the approach I took was basically this, that pre-1947, when I refer to India, I refer to the whole subcontinent. So Panini in today's Afghanistan is part of what I would still call sort of Indian civilization. Figures like Akbar or Dara, Shikoh or Aurangzeb who's there are absolutely part of Indian civilization. Jinnah, I also write about Iqbal and Jinnah, Iqbal the great poet, who wrote in multiple languages, who wrote in Persian, in Arabic, in Urdu, and who, of course, is the national poet in some ways of Pakistan, but also wrote some of the most loved patriotic songs that are sung in India. Jinnah, who for all but 1 year of his life was an essential part of Indian history, was one of India's great liberal and legal minds. And thought very deeply about the issue of protections for minorities. I write about Tagore, who was born in what today is Bangladesh, and who famously is the only person who's the author of 2 national anthems, Bangladesh and India. So absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, these figures don't belong to a nation as such. Post-47, I do basically look at figures who figure within the boundaries of the Indian nation. But I right through, I'm very concerned to link them to cultural and other processes that run right across the subcontinent. So it's, thank you for the question. I mean, I do think that these are figures that belong to the whole region. But, I do think there's sense in using the term India rather than South Asia, particularly for a project like this.
Liaquat?
Liaquat Ahmed. I want to go back to Peter's point about Modi. On the one hand, one reads about the fact that this government is trying to rewrite history, change the history textbooks about the role of the Congress Party, the role of Muslims. On the other hand, I've always felt that somehow India, in all its diversity and argumentativeness, is going to conquer any attempt to impose a sort of single theme from above on the Indian story. So how worried are you about this nationalist trend?
Depends which day of the week you catch me, really. I share both those thoughts, but at the same time, I do also. Well, first of all, to say, the attempt to rewrite history has been going on in India for decades at every level, both at the center and at the state level. As you know, history textbooks, education is a state-level subject. So every time a new government comes into power, I mean, poor kids. I mean, the textbooks are kind of rewritten. So this is a kind of great urge to kind of have one's own figures in, and so that in itself is not new. what I think is a little concerning, more than just normal, is that it's a much more concerted attempt to write to the tune of a particular agenda, and to exclude and include on the basis of that agenda. I think that is underway at the moment, and I think the state education. I mean, it still has a powerful role, and at a time when you don't have great kind of countercurrents, it's difficult. I mean, I think I take your point that there's still there's the press, there's writers, there are people, there are filmmakers, there's so on that are making these arguments all the time in India. But there is pressure on them. And maybe that will actually get them to respond and write even more forcefully and to do even better work. I mean, that's my hope. But it is a battle. I don't think one can just say, it'll even itself out over time because there are countervailing tendencies. I think one has to engage with the argument, and that's partly what I've tried to do in this book, and not to be iconoclastic for the sake of it, just to say these are figures we need to look at as human beings. I mean, one of the things, and I'll stop for. I mean, I think one of the problems with Indian history, I put it this way, is on the one hand, Indians were over-invested in Indian history. And therefore, we want to turn figures into heroes and legends. We don't want them to be really human beings, right? So we're over-invested in their importance. Outside of India, there's an under-investment in Indian history. No one really cares. You don't know what these battles are about. Why are people burning a book that's about Shivaji, an 18th century, 17th century warrior? What the hell is that about? So I wanted to try, between that over-investment and that under-investment, to try and find a way that both acknowledges these are really important figures for the world at large. They have achieved something. But at the same time, they're human beings. And if we see them as human beings, that makes their achievements even more remarkable.
Gentleman here.
I'm Douglas Strusand, and I began my career as a Mughal historian, but since this book is not written for historians, I'm not going to ask you about Mughals in a strict sense. With regard to the role of history in the present, I'd like to ask you about Shivaji and Lakshmi Bai. That it seems to me that the great question regarding these figures in particular is whether the cause that they were fighting for should be identified with the cause of modern India or not. And that it appears to me that you do not take a position on that question in your treatment of those figures. So I'd like to expand on that.
And
I would
who are these figures, by the way?
Yes. I would also like to say that I think you actually underestimate Malik Akbar. That he was one of the few figures in world military history who simply by his presence, by his competence, altered a strategic environment. So that he's even more extraordinary than you make him. But his career path is quite typical for a military slave in the Muslim world, like could have been Idak, for example.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, absolutely. What I say in the essay is that he was not unique. This was a career route that was open to warrior slaves in India, but he was the most exceptional of them. And thank you. I would also very much agree, and I think you put the point very nicely, that he changed the strategic environment in the Deccan, and therefore vis-a-vis the Mughal expansion. I mean, so just on the 2 points, and then I will say something about the Mughals, because I hope that the book also is written for historians. I mean, there are interpretative arguments about some of these figures, which I think are of relevance to historians running through the book. And I'll mention a couple. But Shivaji, yes, is this 17th century warrior from Maharashtra, from the same landscape of the Deccan as I showed. He's now the kind of patron saint of Mumbai, of Bombay. Any of you who've been there, the airport's named after him, the railway station. There's a plan to put a huge statue of him up near the gateway of India. He's everywhere. And he is seen today as this great Hindu militant warrior who resisted Muslim rule. Lakshmi Bai, again, is invoked in a story as the first kind of... The 1857 is often now described, particularly for Hindu nationalists, but also secular nationalists or other nationalists, as the first war of independence. Now, I don't see it that way at all. I see these as much more local struggles that were going on, both in the case of Shivaji, and I talk about how he's trying to build up his own. He strikes deals with anyone, not just with Hindus. In fact, he fights other Hindu warriors at the same time. He's trying to expand his own power domain. Similarly, Lakshmi Bai is trying to hold on to her kingdom. It's not about some larger cause. So I don't slot them into these larger stories. And I think I do indicate that these are not part of this larger story. Now, just very quickly on a couple of Mughal figures, Akbar and Dara, Shikoh, who I write about. And Dara, Shikoh, I also write about Aurangzeb in that essay. And Akbar and Dara, Shikoh are often seen today as kind of paragons of a liberal position, as being cosmopolitan, tolerant, etc. And one argument often is, if only Dara Shikoh had become emperor and not Aurangzeb, India would have gone through a much more syncretic, tolerant period, and there wouldn't have been conflict. There may not have been the partition, etc. Now, I think that's a far over sentimentalized and romantic view. Dara Shikoh would have made a terrible emperor. He probably would have been knocked out much sooner. But what I think is extraordinary about him is his translations from Sanskrit into Persian, which ultimately brought some of the Sanskrit texts to Europe. And Dara Shikoh played a role in that. With Akbar, I think he was very interested in other religions and cultures. He did have religious teachers from many different sects whom he listened to. But the reason he was interested in that was for religious purposes, not for some cosmopolitan secular purposes. He was living at the time of the first Islamic millennium. He thought there would be a new kind of religious figure like the Mahdi who would come to rule. And Akbar thought he might be that. And he would be that by synthesizing all the great religions into a new religion, the sort of Din-i-Ilahi. And I think there's some very interesting scholarship on this in recent years, and to allow him to be read that way. So it's for religious purposes that they were interested in.
Is Akbar buried in Kabul?
Akbar, no.
No.
Not in
Okay.
no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. But going to your thing about the larger Indian.
Yeah.
Any other questions? This lady here.
First of all, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like I'm back in grad school, which is a very pleasant feeling to have, considering I work for the government. But so I'm
It'll be
Kiran.
break soon. No.
So I'm Kiran Pervez. I work at the Foreign Service Institute with the State Department, and I have written several questions, but I'll go with one or two maybe, if you'll indulge me. And I'm intrigued by what you said about nationalism in particular, right? I mean, we have, as you said, I think you mentioned that we have an upsurge of a particular kind of nationalism. And you also earlier mentioned about how perhaps European concepts of nationalism are not necessarily inaccurate, but inadequate to explain the South Asian context. So I guess what I'd like to hear from you is, in terms of where the debate is right now, one thing I keep hearing in a lot of debates is we're in a post-national kind of moment. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I'm not, I don't really see how that applies to India. I mean, I think that I do think if you look, for instance, at the way that the Indian Constitution was established in the late 40s and how it tried to define what was India, it's very careful not to link it to some single marker of identity. It doesn't follow the path of classic 19th century European nationalism, which is defining the nation in terms of language, religion, blood, ethnicity, all those traits. India doesn't have a national language. It has official languages in which the business of government can be conducted, Hindi, English, and a regional state language wherever you happen to be. And it has recognized official languages, the 22 languages now, to which you can go on adding languages, right? It's not a zero-sum game. And therefore, I'll just give you one example. Language, an issue which has ripped new nations apart, not just in South Asia, but in Africa, in other parts of Asia, where the attempt to impose a single national language has caused huge violence. India had this early on in the South, but it dealt with it. And now it's amazing, language is not a live issue of political conflict in India, which is extraordinary if you think about it, because it can divide society so deeply. And that's because if there's a claim to be recognized as an official language, you make the claim and you can ultimately get it recognized if the argument is made. Similarly, you know, the fact that there's these different plural religious codes when it comes to the civil law. Now, these are complicated issues, and you know we can talk at length about them. But that's what I mean by it's a different kind of nationalism. And I think, you know, now there's an attempt to try and make Indian nationalism look more like a singular, more defined, narrowly defined nationalism. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem because I just don't think that that's true to the actual founding definition. And it seems to me that that founding definition is a much more deeply Indian one than the claim today of the BJP and others that they are representing a more Indian version of nationalism. They're actually trying to import a European version of nationalism and rewrite that over what is really a much more Indian definition of the nation.
So to the extent that that particular BJP attempt to Europeanize or have a singular narrative, to what extent do you think that has resonance, and what kinds of competing influences to what you define as the truly Indian definition of nationalism that's much more pluralistic? I guess to go with the theme of your book, what kinds of incarnations, what are those sets of narratives that kind of stave that particular one off, the BJP one?
Well, okay, so that is partly what I hope is kind of embodied by the arguments of this book, that it's to say that it's a very baggy procession of people who, or crowd of people who kind of shape what is our sense of India. It's not a neat little regimented, marching platoon of like I should. And I think there's also, I mean, sort of Congress nationalism also I think was much too narrow in the way in which, and that's why I see my book is both a critique of, if you like, the secular nationalist version and the religious nationalist version, because both are trying to herd a bunch of very obstreperous, dissenting people into a kind of a narrow band, and so I want to say, look, it's much more. So Kabir, I write about Kabir, and he's been kind of assimilated into into different stories about the Indian. And I want to say he's actually a really free spirit. He's one of the freest spirits in the Indian past, extraordinary poet and songwriter, but who doesn't fit into any nationalist or religious or whatever story. So we need to kind of just loosen up a bit on that and recognize this diversity.
Speaker. A former New America intern who was absolutely brilliant.
Not absolutely brilliant, but yes, a former intern. So thank you. I am Ritika. I work now with the World Bank Group. I was very, very intrigued. Thank you for the speech. It was great. I was very intrigued to hear about how you were talking about the resurgence of Buddhism, which is very interesting to me right now because I'm reading this book that Ambedkar wrote about Hinduism and his views on, he was born a Hindu but didn't want to die a Hindu. And it has become much more significant now with the resurgence of the caste debate. It seems interesting that the elite are embracing Buddhism increasingly because they find it spiritual, and the lower castes, at a time particularly when the Hindu right is in power. So I just is influencing the ones in power. So I want to understand your views on how caste plays into the whole narrative of how you see Ambedkar through this lens, and whether you have, I don't know whether you've profiled Mayawati, who's also a particularly intriguing political figure in the caste narrative. So just your views on that.
Yeah, no, well, I don't talk about Mayawati. I should have said, one other criteria for getting into the book was that you had to be, as we say in India, expired. So you had to be dead. So no Mayawati, no Tendulkar, no
Modi.
So I mean, you raise a central question. It's a central question not just in Indian politics today, but it also runs through my book, right from Buddha through to Basava. I talk about this Kannada social critic and poet Basavan, who was also against the caste system. And Ambedkar is an extraordinary figure, and really he's coming into his own in many ways today. I mean, he was an extraordinary figure in life. A man who came from the so-called, formerly called untouchable caste, educated through missionary schooling, acquired not just one but 2 PhDs from the LSE and from Columbia University in this country. Wrote, very interesting articles on finance and currency and so on. Went back to India and became, this major figure in Indian politics. A deep critic of Gandhi and the Congress Party. And played a very large role in the making of the Constitution. And initially, really believed that law and legislation could be the instrument to reform society. And he's one of the originators of a systematic policy of affirmative action, which the Indian Constitution establishes earlier than anywhere else at the level of national law. But he then becomes very disillusioned by the limits of what law can do. And ultimately says, look, the only way the lower caste, the Dalits can get out of this oppressive order is literally by taking us out of that social order and converting. And that's where, shortly before he dies, he has this extraordinary meeting in Maharashtra where he, about 400,000 of his followers, there's a mass conversion to Buddhism, and he converts to Buddhism. And it's not for Buddhism, for the spiritual solace that it offers, although there may be an element of that too, but it's primarily because it's a way of escaping social oppression. And it's very interesting. Ambedkar, in one of his great speeches at the end of the Constituent Assembly debates in India in 1949, he talks about how, and I quote this at the end of my essay, about how democracy in India, it's a great experiment we're opening up, but we're in danger of building a palace on a dung heap unless we can change the social order. And he says, the values of liberty, the values of equality, all these are critical. But the value that we really need to build is fraternity. Until we feel that we're members of a common community, a common family, with the same, where we're not divided by ideas of blood or touch or untouchability, until we do that, we're never really going to be the strong society that can kind of move ahead as we should be. So I think that message, still today for me, is a very resonant one. And it is, of course, for millions of Indians today. And one of the extraordinary things you're seeing in active opposition to the government today is the establishment in Indian universities and among students across the country of what are known as Ambedkar study circles, Periyar study circles. These are groups of students coming to read and debate and think about the work of these thinkers and how they relate to the present society and how it can be changed.
This lady here.
Thank you, Lisa Jorgensen, former World Bank. I'm very compelled to hear how you describe 50 lives instead of 50 voices, or I think the name is just great. And I'm thinking that in this day and age, that feeling of national voices is actually being diminished by the incredible international cash liquidity.
International?
The global liquidity of money, pulling banks and international businessmen into almost another realm. The way I want to focus the question to you is really not the purpose of your book, but India somehow had not been able to find a way to position itself for climate change. China has now moved into the category of agreeing with climate change. Most of the 117 countries who are part of the Kyoto Agreement or the Montreal Protocol are on board. India and Saudi Arabia are the holdouts. Do you have some reflection?
Well, I mean, I think, it's not, I think it relates to something that is kind of quite deep set in its thinking about its place in the world, which is that, it wants to be, it doesn't want to be part of global agreements where it hasn't itself been a voice in determining those rules. And I think in this, but I think having said that, I think that it's moved a lot in the last few years in relation to climate change. And if you even think 5 or 6 years ago, it was taking a much more, or 7 or 8 years ago, it was taking a much more resistant position and really saying, this is not India's mess, it's been made by others, why should India have to kind of hold back its development plans to, et cetera, et cetera. Now that, I think, has moved a long way, because I think India recognizes that, climate change, I mean, China has to be also bound by these rules, and India will also have to be bound by these rules. I was also, the fact that it initially indicated it was going to sign up, and then has now kind of said, well, we'll take a bit more time over it. But I guess my short answer would be, I think it is moving in the direction towards getting on board. But it's also wanting to play to sort of a local Indian audience to say that it's not a kind of this is not being done under pressure from other states and so on. But I think there is a recognition that the issue is a very, very important one, and it's really going to affect India, and India can't pretend that it's someone else's problem.
Not when Delhi is the most polluted city in the world.
Yeah.
If I could just follow up, do you think that's because of the age of your negotiators, or is it because there isn't actually a newspaper or a green movement or a forcing function within the country that has an active enough voice?
Yeah. Well, there are powerful green movements and environmental movements in India, and some very, think tanks and others that are doing some very good work on this issue and really showing how India's current energy use is simply unsustainable, way beyond unsustainable. And these are feeding into the policy process. So I think it's a kind of it's a kind of deep-set bureaucratic inertia in kind of getting on board to this. But I also think that there's definite movement in the sort of acceptance of this as being an issue that India has to acknowledge.
Well,
probably not fast enough and as much as it should be. But
we want to leave a little time for Sunil to sign books. We also want to thank him for a brilliant presentation. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.